He was cornered, pinned between a sky stitched with searchlight blades and a sea that reflected nothing but the silhouettes of iron leviathans. Around him, tracers stitched bright threads through the night, and the anti-aircraft barrage bloomed like angry stars. The little biplane shuddered under the assault, canvas and wood creaking as if protesting the disrespect. In the open cockpit, the cold bit through gloves and uniform, a dry metallic wind that tasted faintly of oil and sea spray. He could see only the flash of shells and the pale moon on the horizon. Every instinct told him to turn and run. Instead, he held steady, eyes fixed on a line of shadow that shouldn't have been so close. A battleship hulking at anchor, its decks full of men asleep in a complacent harbor. The plan was reckless. The machine was obsolete. The courage, though, was very real. This is the night when a handful of fragile biplanes, Fairey Swordfish, with their linen skins and fixed slats, slow enough to seem archaic beside sleek monoplane fighters, changed what commanders thought possible. The squadron that should have been prey became predator, not because of speed or armor, but because someone in command embraced a seemingly crazy idea. Take naval aviation into the dark and lob torpedoes into a well-defended harbor where battleships thought themselves safe. It was audacious. It was dangerous. And for one man in the middle plane of the second wave, cornered by searchlights and tracer, that single decision was the difference between being trapped and being the instrument of an unlikely success. To understand how an obsolete biplane came to fly into the teeth of a harbor bristling with guns, you have to step back from the flare-lit chaos and look at the map, the politics, and the stubborn logic of naval thinkers who refuse to accept conventional limits. The Mediterranean in late 1940 was a table of uneasy balances. The Italian fleet sat concentrated in its home ports, and the British Mediterranean fleet, stretched, committed, and cautious about risking capital ships in close quarters, could not simply meet it head-on. Taranto, a natural harbor with narrow approaches and deep water near the mole, had become a comfortable bastion for the Italian Regia Marina. From the deck of the battleships, the guns pointed seaward. From ashore, searchlights could sweep the sky. A fleet at anchor is always tempting for an attacker. The question was how to get there without paying the price in metal. Enter the Fairey Swordfish. To most eyes in 1940, it looked like a mistake. A two-bay biplane with an open cockpit, fixed undercarriage, and the gait of an airplane from an earlier decade. It could be mocked for its slow speed, and it certainly couldn't outrun modern fighters. But those very deficiencies were what made it suitable for a night torpedo raid. Its low wing loading and generous lift allowed it to fly slowly and steadily at very low altitude without stalling. Its linen-covered frame absorbed and muddied certain sounds. Its stall behavior was forgiving, and its sturdy undercarriage could handle the stresses of operating off a carrier. Most importantly, it could carry a torpedo, the blunt instrument needed to put a battleship on her beam ends. The plan that night did not spring from the whim of an individual pilot. It was not a lone, desperate improvisation. It was command-level audacity. The Admiralty's naval aviation leadership, led by Admiral Andrew Cunningham and his staff, along with the Vice Admiral in charge of aircraft carriers, embraced a concept that many considered foolhardy. Rather than massing battleships to force a fleet action, they would use air power in a confined, surgical way. Night would be their ally. Darkness could be the cover under which slow biplanes, flying low and steady, could place torpedoes in the narrow water of a harbor. It was, by any reasonable measure, a crazy idea, and that's precisely why it worked. Preparation for that kind of strike looks different from the drills of a surface fleet. There were no massive gunnery salvos, no endless target practice on the gun deck. Instead, crews practiced navigating by stars and by coastline, calculating headings with hand tools, cross-checking positions by dead reckoning, and occasional furtive glances at a compass. The Swordfish crews carried silk escape maps that could be folded small and tucked into life jackets, not so much as a guarantee of safety, but as a talisman of practicality. They kept pocket calculators of an older sort, trig tables, and plotting sheets, and they learned the odd intimacy of low-altitude flying, how to read the sea, how to use the sound of a wave to judge height, how to find a gap in a bank of clouds that aligned with a narrow channel. There was an almost domestic side to the final hours before getting underway. On the flight deck of HMS Illustrious, men moved with practiced economy. The carrier was a hive, torpedoes being swung into position, wings being folded into neat cords, fuel lines checked twice, and the Swordfish crews huddled in canvas and greatcoats against the salt air. Someone put on a record of opera in an attempt to drown the tension. Small pots of heating chocolate circulated through the squadrons, a brief and bitter comfort. For the observers, men like Lieutenant John Neal, the cockpit was not only a workspace but a diary desk in the sky. Neal wrote, in small clipped handwriting that would later become one of our windows into that night, "Plot on my thigh, moon high." It is the curt detail of that sentence that makes the raid human. A man with a map pressed to his leg, a navigator's tools cramped against his knees, the sea spread black below. John Neal was paired with Sub-Lieutenant Spike Spark, a pilot whose logbooks show him launching from Illustrious into nights like this with a kind of steady competence. In other aircraft, observers like Alfie Sutton and pilots such as Tiffy Torrance Spence formed the second wave. These were not nameless swarms. They were trained teams, bound by a blend of procedure and trust. They practiced until the maneuvers were mechanical, taxiing down the carrier, the brief lurch of catapult-like effect from the short flight deck, the breath-stealing lift as the wheels found the air. The technical demands were unglamorous but precise. A torpedo dropping into a harbor needed a particular run, low, slow, and straight enough that the torpedo's gyros could stabilize it and run true to the target. The ideal drop altitude sat in the danger zone, low enough that the torpedo wouldn't have time to bury itself in the silt, and deep enough that it wouldn't hit the surface and break. Contemporary reports and later technical briefings put that sweet spot at roughly 30 feet above the water, give or take, depending on the weight and balance of the aircraft and the torpedo's fittings. To release a torpedo at that altitude, at night, under fire, required nerve, discipline, and a particular kind of calm that only comes with rehearsal. There was also human improvisation layered over the official plan. Some things could not be simulated in training. The shuddering noise of shells exploding nearby, the way flames from deck flares paint the sea a suddenly bright orange, the small, sharp smell of cordite carried on the wind. John Neal's log notes these sensory fragments with economy. In one tiny line he wrote, "Most frightening and thrilling day ever." It is not a technical report. It is a man's admission of how near terror and exhilaration can coexist at the same moment. These fragments of personal testimony are not dramatic inventions. They are the recorded impressions of those who were there. The raid itself was organized as a two-wave affair. The first wave's task was to begin the commotion, to drop flares, to draw searchlights and fire, and to make the harbor look like a boiling pot of confusion. Those flares were a kind of illumination come deception. Bright, white, and relentless, they revealed parts of the harbor while leaving others in deeper shadow. The second wave, arriving minutes later, would use the chaos to find the capital ship's vulnerable sides and launch torpedoes into them. Timing was everything. The plan demanded that both waves meet the harbor at near-perfect synchronization, that the first wave's flares and the second wave's torpedoes overlap without friendly interference. It is the kind of orchestration that has a high tolerance for human courage, but a low tolerance for error.
On Illustrious, departure was methodical. Pilots and observers climbed into cockpits, securing maps and adjusting instruments by torchlight. Men checked one another's restraint harnesses with the quiet economy of those who have to be efficient with both words and time.
Engines potted and hummed into life, the Swordfish's Bristol Pegasus making a thrumming sound that seemed more like a large insect than a warplane. When the launch ran, the aircraft skimmed the carrier's deck and climbed into the night in ones and twos, leaving the carrier a small bright abscess in the sea behind them. The crossing to Toronto was long in both distance and mental burden. It was roughly a 170-mile transit. Enough time for nerves to settle, for men to check their instruments and mentally rehearse their roles, for the cold to seep into bones despite layered uniforms. Over water at night, with only the faint starlight and the glimmer of distant coastline to guide them, the crews had to trust their calculations and their flying. A single navigational error could place a Swordfish over open sea instead of harbor, or worse, over a well-defended coastline where daylight fighters could await them. Clouds loomed as enemies too. Patches of high cloud could mask an entire formation until the last moment, leaving pilots to fight both nature and the enemy's defenses simultaneously. One of the unforgiving truths of night operations is how small errors compound. A misread heading, a moment's lag in watching a compass, an unaccounted-for current could shift the whole formation by miles. Still, the crews of Illustrious found their bearing. The first wave reached the harbor and began its work. Flares bloomed, searchlights stitched the air, and the harbor woke to a cacophony of sudden illumination and gunfire. The flares did more than light up the enemy. They forced the defenders to reveal their hand, to commit shells and tracers to the night where they might otherwise have been conserved for daylight encounters. From the second wave's perspective, the harbor transformed in an instant. What had been a flat, ink-black sweep of water became a stage of light and shadow. Towers of black steel, the battleships, stood out against the flare glow, their gunhouses like dark teeth. The Swordfish pilots threaded their way through this menu of danger with a strange, focused calm. The vulnerable side of a battleship is not the armored belt, but the waterline. A torpedo entering and detonating under the keel could buckle plates, flood compartments, and render a capital ship helpless at anchor. For the observers in their cockpits, the job was to get the pilot into that narrow approach corridor, call the release point, and hope that the torpedo's run was undisturbed. Everything in those minutes centered on precision. Observers watched for flags strewn on masts, the dark angle of a ship's wake, the reflected light on a hull. A glance could mean the difference between passing harmlessly astern and striking at the ship's flank. Anti-aircraft fire, meanwhile, tried to create a box barrage, a concentrated envelope of lead that would make low-level approaches suicidal. The box was an aerial geometry meant to close down the lanes of approach. Searchlights painted over the waves, and shells burst in columns that left curtains of spray. To be cornered under such an arrangement was to feel as though the night had narrowed itself into a trap. But here, too, were advantages that the Swordfish could exploit. Their low speed meant that their torpedoes would have less forward velocity imparted at release, giving the weapon a steadier initial path. Their stable flight allowed for the kind of straight, predictable run that a torpedo's gyroscope favored. And because these were night attacks, the defenders' reaction times, though vicious, were complicated by limited visibility. The flares and the confusing geometry of light and shadow could be turned against the harbor's defenses if the attacking crews trusted their instruments and each other. Not every moment was purely technical calculation. There were flashes of human comedy and private rituals stitched through the danger. A cigarette, once the plane was aloft and the immediate business of navigation under control, was a small defiance of fear. A spoonful of chocolate, shared and bickered over, became a tiny, absurd luxury. A pilot might hum a snatch of a tune into a dead microphone. An observer might make a crude sketch in a logbook to calm a shaking hand. These acts were not trivial. They were the psychological glue that kept a crew functioning under stress. On the flight deck and later in the debriefs, officers and men spoke of a mixture of planning and improvisation. Admiral Cunningham, known for his understanding of naval air power, and the carrier leadership had placed their bets on a tactic that, if it failed, could have cost many aircraft and valuable crews. It was not a gamble made lightly. Intelligence had reported the concentration of the Italian fleet, and commanders recognized that traditional surface action courted unacceptable risk. The decision to employ a night torpedo raid was, in its way, an expression of adaptability, of turning what many called obsolescence into an operational edge. The biplane's very slowness allowed precise low-level work. Its simplicity made it resilient in ways that more complex machines were not. Back in the cockpits, crews did their jobs. Observers called headings and checked bearing markers. Pilots settled into the groove of the approach. The sea beneath them murmured. The faint lights of the harbor winked like an impudent constellation. For Lieutenant John Neal, that approach contained a compact series of sensations he later tried to reduce to words on the cramped pages of his logbook. He wrote, with that same clipped honesty, "Moonlight, plot tight, heart in throat." It is a terse line, but in it sits the narrowing of focus that a man experiences when life is distilled into a sequence of tasks. As the second wave closed, the geometry of danger tightened. The flares from the first wave threw long shadows. Searchlights began to crisscross, and the volume of fire increased. The Swordfish, utterly vulnerable to direct hits, yet paradoxically difficult to hit when flying so low and slow beneath searchlight beams, pressed forward. In one cockpit, a gunner half-turned and glimpsed the silhouette of a battleship superstructure. In another, a pilot smelled the faint tang of cordite among the sea air and felt the aircraft shiver as another shell passed near. At this point, the narrative slows and accelerates in turn. The slow meticulousness of plotting, headings, times, and altitudes collided with the sudden violence of the attack. The men had spent hours rehearsing the map. Now they had seconds to execute it. The crucial moment would be the release, when the observer, reading the drift and the distance, called for the torpedo to go. For many crewmen, this was an almost irrationally intimate act. A handful of seconds when the fate of man aboard distant decks and the lives of the crew themselves hung on a metal cylinder that would glide under the water and run toward mass and momentum. And then, as the second wave edged into position, the harbor itself became a theater of light. Shells burrowed into the night and sprayed salt and noise in columns. The Swordfish slipped forward like moths toward a dangerous flame. For those in the center of that formation, being cornered took on a geometric meaning. Searchlights above and guns on either side, arranging a kind of lethal perimeter. In that box, it was easy to imagine that there was no way out except death or surrender. Yet that very box, created by the defenders' own fire and by their confidence that a slow biplane could not survive such exposure, is what the attack relied upon. The defenders committed to a pattern of fire that, paradoxically, made some approaches more predictable. The attackers used that pattern against them. It is tempting in hindsight to paint the scene as a sequence of cinematic acts, each with its dramaturgical clarity. The truth is messier, a tangle of light, smoke, shrapnel, and the low mechanical roar of 1,000 considerations. Pilots adjusted for wind and current. Observers judged how long the torpedo would take to stabilize. And the men prayed or swore or laughed in tiny, improbable bursts. They were individuals making precise choices under pressure. They were a squadron embodying a command decision that had refused to be conventional. As the second wave neared the point of no return, the narrative narrows on a single cockpit. The pilot's hands are steady on the stick.
The observer's eyes flick to compass and map. A lamp glows faintly against the map's silk, showing a plotted course that has to be held to within yards. Beyond the narrow frame of that little canvas and wood world lies a harbor full of lethal opportunity. Beyond that, a command's audacious idea hangs in the balance.
If they pulled back, if they faltered, the harbor would remain a safe port for the enemy, and those who had flown would return with nothing but the taste of wasted chance. If they pressed forward, they stood a real chance of changing the calculation that had kept the Italian fleet at anchor. It is at this knife edge, when the men in the biplanes accept the danger not as fate, but as a necessary part of the plan, that the human and strategic threads converge. The decision made in a briefing room months earlier, the technical realities of the Swordfish, the meticulous plotting on silk maps, and the raw nerve of the men in cockpits all culminate in an instant of action. The torpedo run, when it comes, will be more than a weapons delivery. It will be a test of whether command-level innovation can survive the crucible of execution. And yet, even as the planes close, there are unexpected frictions. One aircraft lags behind, its engine coughing in a way that signals a minor mechanical problem, but a major psychological one. Another pilot sees a flash too near the plane's tail and judges whether to bank or hold straight. In one observer's log there is a sketch, less an instruction than a memory, of the way a flare burned strange over the water and threw up a false horizon. Small things become huge in such a context. Every micro-decision carries amplified weight. If the raid is to succeed, it will not be because of one impulse, but because of synchronized tiny acts done under pressure. That is the human crux of command-level audacity. A plan can be brilliant in concept, but worthless without disciplined men to carry it out. Conversely, bravery alone cannot substitute for planning. Both must meet in that narrow moment. When the first torpedoes begin to fall, when explosions ripple across the harbor and a battleship groans under the blow, historians will later argue about influence and consequence. For the men in those cockpits, in those seconds, they know only that they had accepted a risky plan and were seeing it tested by fire. A final, stubborn detail returns us to the title. He was cornered. The box of anti-aircraft fire had tightened, the searchlights had painted him white, and the torpedo was a weight on a release rack beneath his belly. There was no heroic solo improvisation that saved that night. Instead, a command's willingness to think differently and crew's refusal to let fear dictate their choices created a moment where an apparently obsolete machine could do what modern doctrine said it couldn't. That collision of institutional boldness and individual grit is the essence of what made the raid possible. At the edge of the harbor's light, the aircraft held. Engines droned. The men breathed through the cold and the noise and the sense that the next few seconds would define everything. The night, which had so far been an ally, now felt like an accomplice and a test. Behind them, the carrier waited to receive whatever returned. Ahead lay steel and the chance of a decisive blow. In the cramped cockpit, hands that had adjusted dials, checked bearings, and steadied maps now found the release lever. Time compressed to a line ahead. The plane shuddered as the pilot eased her into her final run, and the observer's voice, low and precise, confirmed the call. The next moments would determine not only the fate of the aircraft and its crew, but the meaning of the crazy idea that had put them there. Would it validate command-level imagination, or would it become, in the grim jargon of analysis, a costly failure? The men could not see the answers from their narrow, dangerous vantage. They could only carry out their part, trusting that the audacity of planners and the steadiness of their hands were enough. And so they flew on, into the harbor's electric maw, the sea below a black mirror, the ships outlined like sleeping beasts.
the flares painting them in savage relief. Shadows and light traded places with every shallow breath of wind. The release point approached. The torpedo banged and settled beneath the plane. The observer's hand hovered over the lever, and in that suspended instant the world seemed to hold its breath with them. The observer's hand left the lever for the smallest of breaths, and then returned. The torpedo rolled free with a soft metallic thunk that seemed impossibly loud in the canvas cocoon of the cockpit. For an instant the night held its breath with them. The heavy cylinder slid beneath the plane and vanished into the black, leaving a wet, foaming seam that caught the flare light and disappeared into the harbor. The pilot eased the stick forward to keep the aircraft steady and straight. The observer bent over his slide rule and watches, counting the seconds it would take for the weapon to steady itself, for its gyros to settle, for the run to begin. Seconds is all a torpedo needs, and the world can change in a handful of them. A thin white wake cleaved the water where the torpedo ran, a thread that led toward an enormous shadow. Then a bloom, a column of water and flame, an answering shock that threw salt spray high. The sound of it reached the planes as a delayed, muffled thunder. The light painted the undersides of wings and the faces of men in a harsh, sudden noon. Men in the cockpits stared at the horizon and at the reflection of the explosion, and for a moment neither the technical craft of navigation nor the calculus of command mattered as much as the raw sensory fact of an enemy ship being rent by steel. It was the proofing moment for the audacious plan. Where doctrine had argued that slow biplanes were liabilities, the night had allowed them to do precisely what their designers intended, to carry a heavy, blunt weapon, low and true, into a target that could not easily maneuver. The torpedo's underkeel detonation made the difference. Bulkheads groaned, plates buckled, compartments flooded.
Men aboard those capital ships scrambled to understand what kind of weapon had been delivered into their midst. On the carrier and in the cockpits, reactions were a mixture of stunned disbelief and a sudden, raw hope. But victory that night was not a single tidy headline. Explosions scattered fire and wreckage across Taranto's water, and in the chaos other torpedoes missed or ran harmlessly. Anti-aircraft guns, maddened and combative, kept churning, and the box barrage continued to stitch lethal patterns across the skies. Some torpedoes fouled or failed, some ran true. Radios crackled with terse updates, reports that a ship listed, that fires raged, that a boiler room went quiet. Men shouted through microphones, their voices rough with adrenaline and cold. On Illustrious, signal lamps clicked and semaphore flags flashed as confirmation trickled in. Aircraft back on course, some damaged, a handful missing. The attack forced the harbor into a new kind of disorder. Flares burned down like second suns, creating islands of visibility surrounded by fathoms of opaque night. Firefighters on the docks moved like ants under that glare, trying to cut hoses through smoke and to save what could be saved. The defenders scrambled to compensate for the surprise of day turned night, and in their scrambling they sometimes exposed themselves further. The Swordfish teams had aimed for that confusion, not merely to destroy, but to show that harbor walls and calm anchorages were not impermeable. The flight home was an exercise in still more grit. Engines were checked and rechecked. A skipper who had lost an engine managed to nurse her back on one, maintaining altitude by sheer force of will and understanding of the machine's limitations. Another aircraft kissed the sea, the float of spray making contact with the wheels, and the pilot wrestled the controls until the plane climbed again, engines complaining but intact. That near miss could have been a catastrophe. Instead, it became another tale told later in debriefs as an example of how training and temperament combined to salvage fragile chances. Not everyone returned. 2 Swordfish did not come back to Illustrious that night.
Men who had left full of nervous jokes and a kind of quiet restraint were now listed as missing, and the ship's company felt the old, bitter trade-off of operational daring. For every measure of success, a shadow of loss follows. Those absences were noted in the official returns, recorded in neat columns that somehow could not capture the faces and the private jokes now lost to the sea. Loss did not negate courage, it underscored it. When the signal that matters most in wartime found its way through the fleet's communications, it was short and unmistakable. Admiral Andrew Cunningham's message, laconic, professional, arrived and was later paraphrased in the shorthand of sailors, most satisfactory.
It was a succinct recognition from the man whose willingness to press naval aviation forward had put the plan on the table. On the deck and in the wards of returning aircraft, men cheered softly, cried quietly, and smoked with new appreciation. Reports from the field were filed. Attack completed. One terse line in a logbook. The carrier's wardroom broke one rule and allowed the music to spill a little louder that night. For Lieutenant John Neal, the return carried an intimate geography of relief. He later sketched, in small economical lines in his log, the way his hands had found a cigarette once the plane had been secured and the adrenaline had thinned. He did not attempt an epic sentence. He wrote, in that clipped, purposeful style, details that carried the weight of exhaustion and of something like satisfaction. The little comforts cut through the scale of what had happened. A cigarette handed from one man to another. The dark shape of the carrier against the sea. The scraping footsteps of deck crew. The war's great moments often live in the small artifacts of human behavior. A cup of warming drink. A laughed at joke. A thought scribbled late at night. In the days that followed, the damage assessments came in, and with them the more sober machinery of history. Italian capital ships were badly enough damaged to be out of immediate action. Some would require months in dry dock. That operational pause was valuable, but the long-term military weight of the raid would not be a matter for exultant telegrams. Historians would later argue and re-argue the scope of the raid's consequences. Some saw Toronto as a demonstration that naval air power could strike decisively at ships even in perceived safe anchorages, a validation of carrier doctrine. Others cautioned that a single raid, however audacious, did not in itself overturn broader strategic balances. What is indisputable is that the raid made commanders across navies think differently about the vulnerability of ships at anchor and about the role of air-launched torpedoes in naval warfare. An expert who has studied interwar and wartime naval planning puts it plainly. The technical combination that night, a stable, slow aircraft, a well-timed torpedo run, and the tactical use of darkness, created conditions favorable to success that planners had suspected but not yet proved in combat. That proof mattered. It was not a miracle. It was the product of rehearsal, doctrine, and the courage to execute a high-risk operation when conventional options seemed worse. There were immediate institutional effects. Carrier captains and admirals took renewed interest in the tactical reach of their air groups. Some doctrine notes were rewritten, not with fanfare, but with the sober notation that harbor defenses were not absolute.
The idea of striking enemies in ports found a place on the mental map of naval chiefs. It would, in time, inform thinking about other theaters where anchored ships were believed to be safe. Yet prudence remained. Commanders did not assume every night raid would succeed. Instead, Toronto became a careful example of how a specific set of circumstances, technology, weather, courage, and timing can be exploited. The raid did not single-handedly win the Mediterranean for Britain, but it created a new kind of problem for any navy that took refuge behind its anchorages. The human cost and the human valiance stitched through the operation also left quieter legacies. Surviving crew wrote home in short, battered letters. Men who had been in the cockpits spoke for years afterwards with a strained brightness about what they had seen and what they had felt. Some of them visited the makeshift hospitals where wounded enemy sailors were treated and found an odd sense of shared professional respect across the lines of conflict. The pilots and observers who returned to service did so with the knowledge that they had been part of something more than an isolated fight. They had pushed a doctrine forward while paying a personal price. For John Neal, the raid was a human ledger of contradictory entries: fear, exhilaration, loss, and a strange, quiet satisfaction that a well-carried-out plan had worked. He and his comrades had been cornered, boxed in by searchlights and AA fire, but they had been guided there by a decision at the top that took a different view of risk. That does not diminish the individual acts of courage displayed in cockpits and in the Black Sea below, but it does reframe them. The crazy idea was not a mad improvisation of a single pilot. It was a command-level embrace of naval aviation's potential at night, coupled with crews who trusted and executed that plan. Years later, the story of the Swordfish and Toronto would be told in museums and in hangars where restoration crews coaxed decades-old fabric and wood back into the air. There is a peculiar poetry in the sight of an old biplane, linen taut over wooden ribs, a slow-turning prop, an open cockpit that reveals the narrow world of charts and ropes, climbing into a January sky at a living history event. When people see a restored swordfish fly, they often remark at how unassuming it looks, how fragile. Those who remember the night at Toronto remind them, appearances mislead. That machine, at its most vulnerable, performed a function that heavier, sleeker planes could not on that specific night. A curator at one such museum, who has handled logbooks and the silk maps and the torpedo racks, will sometimes hold up a small browned piece of paper and say, "This is where the human story is. You can read the numbers anywhere. What you feel here are the men."
It is a compact, factual remark that returns us to what mattered more than doctrine: the men who bent their nerves to a plan and flew through fire to make it real. Back in the narrative arc of the raid, the Swordfish returned to Illustrious carrying a mix of the triumphant and the broken. Aircraft that had taken flak wore it like battle honors: punctured fabric, charred gunwales, and the occasional hairline crack where the force of an explosion had found the weak points of a light machine. Deck crews moved efficiently to patch and refuel, to ready for the next call that might come. The men disembarked, shaken, some elated, some silent. On a cramped carrier mess deck, someone joked about the absurdity of winning with biplanes. The laughter was brittle and real. Later that night, in whatever spare moment could be found, men wrote in logbooks and diaries, stumbling to find words that could hold the weight of what they had seen. Time, as it does, layered interpretation over action. Naval analysts wrote reports. Historians debated which lessons were generalizable and which were peculiar to the night's weather and enemy dispositions. Some voices in the decades that followed placed Toronto alongside other seminal naval air attacks as a turning point in naval history. Others cautioned against teleologies that made of a single night a universal law. The balanced verdict landed somewhere between. Toronto was a powerful demonstration of the potential of carrier-borne aviation, and it was a clear example of how adaptability can convert apparent weaknesses into tactical advantages. The last human frame of this story returns us to the man who felt cornered in the center of the box. He survived by luck and skill, and because a command had chosen a path that made such survival useful rather than purely tragic. He went on to write, in those clipped, pointed lines that logbooks demand, small notes that capture a night in a few concrete impressions. They are not grand claims of destiny. They are the imperfect and honest traces of men who had been tested. Years later, as restorers fed oil into an old radial engine and coaxed life into a resurrected swordfish, spectators would watch and feel that same mix of disbelief and admiration.
The sight of canvas and wood, of open cockpits and slow climbing wings, is less an anachronism than a reminder. Ingenuity is often about using what you have in a way others did not imagine. The ship that seemed cornered was not saved by a single cinematic improvisation of a lone pilot. It was rescued by institutional daring married to individual discipline. The one crazy idea was, in truth, a deliberate gamble, to let slow planes fly at night, and to accept the dangers of that gamble because the alternatives were worse.
In the end, the image that lingers is both small and enormous. A battered plane slipping from the sea toward a waiting carrier. Men hauling ropes and pushing with cold, numb hands. A logbook closed at last for the night. A cigarette passed between two hands that have seen more than they will ever say. The title of this story, The Man Who Was Cornered Until One Crazy Idea Saved His Squad, finds its truth in that combination of things. He was cornered, yes. The night had turned on him like a trap. But a bold, unconventional decision by commanders and the courage of crews who executed it under the most exacting conditions turned cornering into opportunity. The raid did not erase the cost of war. It did change some calculations about how to wage it. It remains a sharp instance of how, on a single night, doctrine, daring, and human resolve intersect to produce results that neither pure caution nor blind bravado could achieve on its own. In the slow, honest light of history, the Swordfish's night over Toronto endures as a reminder. Sometimes what looks obsolete becomes essential when someone is willing to imagine another way through the corner. If this story moved you, and you'd like more close, human accounts from the smoke and engine room of history, subscribe for deeper dives that put you in the cockpit and on the deck. And if you ever have the chance, visit a museum where a restored swordfish still flies. Seeing the plane in the air, hearing the old radial thrum, gives shape to the fact that real people once did extraordinary things with fragile machines and stubborn resolve. He had been cornered, pinned under searchlights, surrounded by tracer, and staring into the mouths of guns. The crazy idea that put a handful of canvas and wood machines into that place saved more than a mission. It saved the sense that ingenuity and courage, properly focused, can open an escape where none seems to exist. The plane that weathered the night and the men who flew it returned to tell a simple truth. Bold thinking, matched with professional execution, can turn the corner between defeat and a hard-won, costly success.